Okay, hi everybody. Thanks so much for coming out to hear about Generation X. This talk comes out of work we are currently doing in preparation for an upcoming exhibition called Growing Up X. And so I'm going to run you a little bit through what to expect with this exhibition and then give you a sneak peek of some of the objects that are going to be featured in this exhibition and why we chose to highlight them. So very first question. Who's in Generation X? So for our purposes, we are roughly calling it those born between 1965 and 1980, although there's a little bit of leeway, as always, on either side of this generation. So Gen Xers, their parents are boomers and the silent generation. Their younger siblings and then kids are millennials and Gen Z, and Gen X is right in the middle. And I am at the tail end of Generation X myself, so sometimes I might be slipping into we to describe us. Let's see. What's going on? So Growing Up X is an exhibition exploring how toys, technology, and culture shaped the members of Generation X. A lot of people I've talked to are a little bit dismayed that they are now old enough to be memorialized in a museum. And we are between 42 and I think it's 57 years old at this point. And so the point of this exhibition, there is an element of nostalgia that I will acknowledge. We are hoping to kind of tug on the memory strings of people who grew up in this time period. But on the other hand, we are trying to dig deep into some of these issues and how they shaped a generation that's often overlooked in the media. And so some of the issues that we grew up with, and each of these objects represents an issue, formed us as kids in ways that we won't truly appreciate until we're grown and can look back and unpack and put it into context. So that's part of what this exhibition is seeing how all the things that just were part of Gen X's world and they took for granted, that's the way it is, turned us into the people that we are today, influenced how we show up at work, how we show up as parents, how we show up as citizens of a world that is much different than the one we grew up in. Where can I see this exhibit? Growing Up X will run January 28th through September 4th at the Illinois State Museum, downtown Springfield. And then in November, it will move to our Lockport Gallery, where it will run for another 6 months. So stay tuned. I hope you'll come out to see it when it opens. And why Gen X? Why not Gen X? Generation X has been called one of the least parented, least nurtured generations in U.S. history. It's smallest by numbers. There are about, I think, 62 to 63 million people who identify as Generation X. This is about 10 million less than the generations on either side, the boomers and the millennials. Famously, in culture, the boomers and the millennials are sniping at each other on social media, and Gen X is always kind of the one that's like left to our own devices. And this is a pattern that originated since childhood, where a generation that didn't have a lot of adult supervision growing up and has grown up to continue to kind of be ignored in the larger American culture. And so our museum is all about lifting up underrepresented stories, and we felt that Gen X is truly an underrepresented generation. How do we do research? So it's a tricky thing to do research on a large body of people who are still alive, right? They're still around and can very much contribute to the record. And so what we did was established a questionnaire that asked a whole range of questions. What did you play with? What kind of music did you listen to? Were you a latchkey kid? What did you wear? And we put it out there. We got some nice assists from some media pickups, and we ended up getting more than 1,000 responses in. Which was really nice because, you know, each person's experience is unique, but when you have 1,000 to look at, you kind of see certain trends that kind of pop out. And so there's some debate, like, do generations even matter, right? Like, is it all just kind of this abstract concept that really doesn't have any bearing on who people are? After doing research on this exhibit, reading through 1,000 response surveys, I think there's something to generations. I think there's something to a common experience that people born at the same time all went through and kind of lived through that doesn't exist anymore. So it's a collective set of memories. It's a collective set of influences. And again, unpacking that can help to show who these middle-aged people are who are now sort of in the prime of their parenting years. They're caring for older parents, their working years. Who are these people? Who are we? So what will I see in this exhibition? And I'm glad you asked. I'm going to run through some of the objects that we're going to see here, just a sneak peek. I've been cautioned not to give away the milk for free, just give enough so we hope you show up and see the full exhibit. So the first thing is this key, which is obviously a huge representation of a normal sized door key that was made by our exhibit's chief, Paul Countryman. And why do we have a giant key? Anyone?
Latchkey.
Latchkey kids, yes. So Gen X grew up in this like perfect vortex of economic and social change that wound up with us being given a house key to tie around your neck on a piece of yarn and let yourself in after school and kind of fend for yourself. And so to kind of break down some of what was going on. So you have like the post-war boom, right? After World War II. And then this kind of triggers a rethinking of society. So you've got, instead of families binding together for economic survival and stability, now your economics are kind of set, people are doing well. And so people are turning inwards and thinking about their psychological satisfaction. And so this combines with many other factors to lead to a rise in divorce, because all of a sudden marriage isn't about stability, about, keeping a home, raising children. There's an element of like, what's my personal satisfaction? This idea that I need to be married to my soulmate and be living out this romance. And if that's not happening for me, it's okay to dissolve my marriage. And this is added onto by a lot of other factors. You have no-fault divorce becoming legal first in California and then quickly going through all the states. So it becomes much easier to get a divorce. You also have the women's liberation movement, which is kind of changing the way women think about their roles. Women are sort of understanding that there's more to life potentially than, being married, and less impetus to stay in a marriage, especially if it's toxic or abusive or not healthy. And then the rise of women in the workplace gives women an avenue to escape a marriage, because now there's an opportunity where women can be working outside the home to support themselves and their children. You also have going on in the background kind of this globalization of the economy, where factories are being outsourced. That post-war economic boom is really starting to tail off, and the jobs are leaving America, and middle-class wages are stagnant while inflation is growing, which means households that could normally get by on one income, post-World War II, all of a sudden you need two working incomes just to maintain that middle-class lifestyle. And then at the heart of this, so you've got all these things pulling divorces apart or marriages apart, and the rate of divorce jumps from something like 11% of marriages. I have the exact figure. I'm not going to try to make it up. Let's see. Less than 20% of couples who married in 1950 ended up divorced. About 50% of couples who married in 1970 did. And half the children born to married parents in the 1970s saw their parents divorce. So you've got these children who now have divorced households, and this has economic ripples, not unpacking anyone's reasons for leaving, but there is a division of assets, right? Where you once have one home, now you've got two homes. Often there's a mom who needs to go outside the house to work. Her child support may be inadequate. She is going to pull down a split household might be pulling in lower incomes than the combined household. So there's a hit to material resources, to kind of the familiarity. And when mom goes outside the house to work, there's no daycare. This is before daycares were available at all schools. I mean, there's not there are some daycares, but when I became a mother and sent my son to school and realized they had after school childcare, I was like, this is a great idea. I can't believe this is a thing. Someone will just watch my kid after school, because that just didn't exist in the 70s and 80s. And there's also a different idea about, children's independence. People were more into just kind of letting their kids roam free. And so what happens is, again, kids given these keys and, said, come home after school, let yourself in. And so here are some of the reactions that come from Gen Xers that were pulled from these surveys. And we got a gamut, and they really range from people remembering it was great. I came in, I made myself cereal, I watched MTV, I tried to do the chores in 10 minutes that I was supposed to be doing all afternoon when I heard my parents' car pull up in the driveway. There was a lot of, positive memories about the freedom and the independence, which I think becomes baked into our generation. On the other hand, there are some sad and scary things. There are people who say, I was home alone and someone broke into my house and I had to go hide in the shed with my dog. Or, someone bullied me on the way home from school and I ran home crying and no one was there to meet me. So there's this nice edge of independence, but independence means whoever's supposed to be watching these kids isn't, and stuff can happen when people are not supervised, accidents, illnesses, scary things, and kids are on their own to deal with it. So it's like this, half exhilarating freedom and half terror of oh my gosh, I've got no safety net. I'm on my own. So we had these quotes: we were free-range, slightly feral children who ran in packs. Peanuts kind of captured what it was like to be a child in the 70s, with the kids doing things on their own, the unintelligible adult voice heard but never seen. I always felt like I resided in a nice bed and breakfast run by good people. I had house key from the age of 12. Around that time, my mom started working and going to school, so we all had keys to get in. If we forgot, you waited until someone else got home, or you looked for an unlocked window to crawl in. My husband was a latchkey kid. He remembers, forgetting his key and it being January and him standing inside the storm door, for an hour waiting for someone to come and let you in. We raised ourselves and each other. Our parents were either out discovering themselves, my dad hated when his custody time with me interfered with his key parties, or were too busy working multiple jobs to stay afloat, my mother and practically every other single mom. My mom used to put me in front of the TV with a bowl of cereal and set an alarm clock to remind me when it was time to walk to school in second grade because she had to go to work. I can't imagine leaving a second grader to their own devices like that now. Or forget helicopter parenting. They didn't even know where we were, and they trusted us to take care of ourselves and get home safely, and by and large, we did. And so this, if you had to boil down what it meant to be Generation X, this is kind of the common denominator that really rises to the surface, is a generation that was really left on their own devices, for better or worse. Figured things out, entertained ourselves, and probably during the pandemic, you've seen some of those memes, when it was time to be in lockdown and not interact with people, Generation X was like, yes, I've trained for this my whole life, I know how to entertain myself. So moving on, this is He-Man and his friend, his enemy, mortal enemy, Skeletor, and he's riding his cat who's in his Cringer form, but really he should have transformed into Battle Cat. And so He-Man is kind of one of the quintessential toys of the 80s. A lot of people have fond memories of He-Man and playing with He-Man, and he represents a whole lot of forces converging, economic, social, regulatory, all around, what children were exposed to and given to play with. So there's a shift that happens with children's toys in Generation X. Our parents grew up with toys that were largely designed around instructing them for future roles. So, dolls that help you be nurturers and caretakers, building toys, things like that. There's elements of fantasy, and certainly in the wake of World War II, there's this sort of military toys, but they sort of have a purpose and a moral, right? You're fighting your toys for democracy, you're recreating battles. And there's some fantasy play, but what really happens in Generation X is that things get weird, He-Man, here's the backstory of He-Man. His alter ego is Prince Adam. He lives on the planet of Eternia. When he raises his sword in the air and says, by the power of Grayskull, I am He-Man, he transforms into a very muscly man in furry underpants, and he's battling Skeletor, who's goal is to like take over Eternia and especially Castle Grayskull. And there's no like nuance, right? Like we don't know Skeletor's motivation. He's not like communist. He's not amassing a nuclear weapon. He's just bad. And He-Man is just good. And it's like, it's just out there and none of it really makes any sense. And then what you factor in is Reagan and deregulation. So what's going on here is that prior to the 1980s, kids, like what you could advertise on kids programming was very strictly regulated. You couldn't sell toys during a show. You could only have so many minutes of commercials per children's programming. And then under Reagan, there was a new head of the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, who said like, nope, wide open. Everything's fair game. And so what you happened was like prior to that, you might have a successful television or movie and you might license toys after it to a limited degree, although Star Wars really blew that up in the 70s. After that, what you have in the case with He-Man, you have toys that come first, like I want to sell this line of toys. And in He-Man's case, Mattel had actually passed on the opportunity to license Star Wars toys. And they saw the success of Star Wars. And they're like, we need some kind of sci-fi franchise to make money stat. So they came up with He-Man. And then they're like, now we need a backstory for He-Man. And so they created the cartoon to support He-Man. And so these 22-minute cartoons are basically just extended commercials. And they run and, every few episodes, they introduce a new bad guy and you have to collect them all. And soon it spawns this whole like universe of all these figures that's just to like buy. So we're like raised in this era of, consumerism, commercialism. This is also an era where toy makers had to alter the way they marketed their toys because of Generation X's small size. When you've got a generation of kids that's, 65 million strong as opposed to 75 million strong, this is a very like shrunken market for you. And so just advertising toys around Christmas time isn't going to cut it. So now you have toys being marketed directly to children via commercial versus like, parents, buy your child this toy for Christmas. And you have that going on year round. And so like, it's all ramped up, buy. And then on the other, like below that, there's just issues of like gender roles and what it meant to be, masculine, this like big, muscly guy who solves problems with his axe. There's not a lot of nuance or subtlety or whatever, like we said. So this is the orbit that raised us as kids. This is our ecosystem of toys. Okay, moving on to number 3, mixtapes, because Susan said it when she walked in the door, Gen X had best music, and we will argue that until the day we die. And the mixtape is really such an iconic piece of Gen X history. First of all, if you are Generation X, part of your experience is having gone through a lot of technological change as a young person. You might have been born listening to records and 8-track tapes, and then cassette tapes come in, and then CDs come in, and by the time you're a young adult, you've got MP3s. So one of our survey respondents means being Gen X meant I bought my album 4 times in 4 different formats. But the mixtape is the cassette, and this is like this sense of like DIY freedom, right? You've got this convergence of technology, the cassette tape, which is portable and inexpensive, and these decks that have 2 slots where you can dub one from the other. And it gives a sense of freedom of like taking what's out there and creating something of our own on the cheap. And so one quintessential Generation X memory is of having a tape deck loaded and your finger poised on the record button and your favorite song comes on the radio and you hit record and you record it, and there's 10 minutes of the announcer at the beginning and a little bit at the end, and then you just kind of combine them. Or if you have a dual cassette, you can dub one to the other. And this is more than music. This became a language. You give it to your best friend on their birthday. I got one on my 16th birthday that was all like driving themed songs, or you gave it to the person you liked to express your feelings, but when you broke up, you had another tape that you listened to wallow in your angst. And, all these, it's like a shorthand in the language, and it's just not the same anymore. CDs came in, and burning a CD, like ripping a CD, just wasn't the same. And now there's playlists, but there's something about like taking the time and recording each song and handwriting all the lyrics that just felt so like personal, and you're invested in it. And of course, we can't talk about Generation X without talking about MTV. It was launched on August 1st, 1981, and the very first song that was played was Video Killed the Radio Star. And this kind of became a defining experience of the generation. It was just a channel that played music videos 24 hours a day, and a lot of us look back with bitter nostalgia about, remember when MTV used to play music? And you would literally watch it, and this kind of opened up a generation of young people to a wider world. We had survey respondents saying, I grew up in like rural Illinois, and I was seeing rap for the first time, and my mind was blown. MTV gave a platform to women artists, eventually artists of color. They were slow to get on board with that, and there was definitely some racism at the highest levels of MTV in the beginning. But eventually, rap, Madonna, Michael Jackson, these superstars were launched in part, not just because of their music, but their whole persona. It was very theatrical. There were hairstyles, there were clothing styles. It was a whole culture that was just kind of ripe for young people to see and absorb and kind of incorporate into their own lives. And so here's some things that came from our survey respondents. This is one of our kind of epigram quotes: music is the heart of all things Gen X. We were raised on music, and our identities were intertwined with it. I like the one that says, a mixtape could have Prince, Bon Jovi, Depeche Mode, and Run DMC. That made sense in 1987. Growing up in a small town in Southern Illinois, MTV was a huge eye-opener for me. I would be exposed to people I would never meet there, and would learn so much more than I would in my own town. I remember at one point I was listening to music on 8-tracks, records, tapes, and CDs. We definitely lived in a time where technology was constantly changing. And sadly, I was a member of Columbia House, so I did acquire an unusual mix of pop, rock, etc. I was a sucker for the deals. And I throw this in just as a bit of nostalgia, because it's kind of a thing that Generation X will remember. It was, you get like 8 CDs for a penny, but then you're enrolled in this club that will send you a CD every month if you forget to cancel, and everyone forgets to cancel. So you wind up with this like random assortment of things that you're overpaying for and never wanted in the first place. Okay, our next object is Red Dawn. And this gives a window into the experience for Generation X of growing up in the shadow of the Cold War. And we don't hold, like the claim that we were the only ones. Certainly the boomers who came before us also grew up in the shadow of the Cold War. The whole arc of the Cold War changed and evolved and manifested itself in different ways. So of course it started in the wake of World War II when the USSR took control of East Berlin and Eastern European countries to form a Soviet bloc, and the United States was very wary of the expansion of communism. Communism was seen as a threat to capitalism, and capitalism equals democracy, ergo communism is a threat to democracy. And so the United States spent most of the 20th century trying to contain communism. It led to the arms race, the atomic race, where the Soviet Union developed a nuclear bomb. It led to proxy wars in Korea and Vietnam. By the time of the 1970s, there was sort of a détente and things chilled for a little bit, and Nixon went to China and opened up diplomatic relations. And then under Reagan, it ramped back up. So that's kind of the era of the Cold War that I'm focusing on. And it was just this feeling of constant low grade existential fear that the Russians are going to annihilate you in the night. And the idea of, mutually assured destruction, that the only thing stopping war from breaking out is the knowledge that if it were to, both sides would be destroyed and no one would survive. And so this quote from Vanity Fair, I think really says it best. The message was made clear to us all. This could happen. It could happen tomorrow, and you would be, and your shadow would be burned into the ground somehow after you were vaporized. But the only thing worse than dying in a nuclear holocaust would be not dying in it and having to contend with its hellscape aftermath. Anyway, sleep tight. So there's a little bit of this like jaded resignation growing up in the 80s, whereas, earlier generations built bomb shelters and it seemed very optimistic, like we can build a bunker and store up food and we'll survive this. For Generation X, it was like, it'll all be over, like there's just no surviving it. And so you can see some of the reactions that came through in these survey responses. We were supposed to die in a nuclear war. That's what we lived with. The constant fear of being obliterated in a nuclear blast. Nothing happened, and here we are struggling to retire, own a home, and continue on. And some of us never planned for that future because we weren't expecting one. I think as a group, we're resilient and scrappy. We grew up thinking nuclear war was quite possibly going to wipe us all out, and we were thinking about Red Dawn survival scenarios as part of our regular thought process. And so I bring up Red Dawn. It's a movie released in 1984, before Patrick Swayze and Jennifer Grey were dancing in Dirty Dancing. They were fighting the Russians off in their high school. So Soviets invade this, high school, and all the kids have to arm up and fight them off. And it's part of this zeitgeist, right? It shows up like the bad guys of the 80s were the Russians. It was always the Russians. And this idea of nuclear war was ever present. Karen says, we never had to tell someone we were all out of food because we physically oozed the feeling. Maybe the perpetual threat of nuclear war contributed to the mood. To best understand Gen X, binge The Day After. And we're going to have The Day After playing in the exhibit. This aired in 1983, and it's a movie about nuclear war with the United States and Russia and kind of what happens in the aftermath, which was sort of the embodiment of everyone's worst fears brought to life on screen. And I saw it as a kid, and I still remember the part that freaks me out is they see these missiles in the sky, and someone said, what happened? And he said, well, either they've shot first and we had just enough time to get our missiles off, or we're shooting and they're going to retaliate. But either way, game over. It's really bad news. And the Cold War was far more present to my generation. We became so numb to the threat of nuclear war. Our trademark word is whatever. So it's this balancing again of that deep existential terror with you can't sustain a sustained sense of I'm going to die any second. So eventually you get numb to it, and less this kind of apathy, whatever way to cope with it. And then, of course, we saw the Berlin Wall come down, and everything was fine, right? And then now it's not. Now you watch the news, and things are bad in Russia and Ukraine, and it's really kind of calling up a lot, I think, for a lot of people who lived through it the first time, now we're talking about nuclear weapons and communism and Russia again, it's sometimes it feels like we really kind of come full circle. And then the last object to consider is this computer. And this was donated to us. This came out of our survey call for objects. This was Scott Sisak's K-Pro computer. He got it in 1984. It was the family computer. It's a portable computer, which is why I hauled it over. It's got a handle on the back, and it all snaps together so you can lug it around, and it only weighs about 40 pounds. Of course, it's booted up with a floppy drive, and you run a program on a floppy, and when you kind of get to the end of the floppy's memory, then you have to pull it out and put in a new floppy. And the floppies were so touchy, if you looked at them wrong, they would get corroded and you would lose all your homework. And Yeah, so this being all to say that another deep defining characteristic of Generation X is this bridge between the analog world and the digital world. A lot of us grew up typing on typewriters and, not having any idea about the internet, and you go from maybe working on an Apple IIe in your computer lab at school and booting up with floppies to by the time you're in college or a young adult, you like have a phone or a computer on your desktop that's got more power than that thing could ever dream about. And this all happened, fairly quick. So it's this constant adaptation of, new technology. Let me wrap my head around it. Now it's changed again. Let me wrap my head around that. But also remembering life before, kids today are born into a digital world, they have phones at their fingertips, the internet at their fingertips, social media, socialization happens in a digital realm. And we came to that as young people, but we also remember life without it. And so maybe, if the Red Dawn scenario happens, we'll be well poised to go back to the world without, social media and cell phones. And we didn't define our identities based on it. So some of our quotes here are, it seems in our short 50-year span, we've seen such a mind-boggling explosion of technology, and most of us have adapted and adopted. Having an analog childhood and a digital adulthood is a unique position that no other generation has so completely. We can see how technology works and understand it while also being able to see the physical manifestations of what that technology can do. I like this one. I remember seeing a .com on the back of a truck in college and thinking to myself, there's no way this stupid .com thing is going to catch on. I started college in 1995, not knowing what the internet was, and by the time I graduated in 2000, I had AOL, a DSL line, and a cell phone. We grew up before cell phones, computers, or social media, which was great. The last generation of people who made personal connections. And I think this comes out a lot in Generation X's relationship to younger generations, and especially as parents who are struggling to be supportive of kids who are growing up in this digital landscape. And what I realized about, my own son, he's 10 years old, and he's on like Facebook Messenger Kids and talking to people on Discord, playing video games, is Gen X was physically unsupervised. We ran around our neighborhoods, our towns, no one was watching, no one knew what we were doing. Current generations, I feel like, are digitally in the Wild West. Like, I don't know what my son's doing online. I always tell him, if someone tells you to get in his van, he'll give you candy online, or, ask you his name, tell him no. Like, I don't know how people are approaching children, who's who online. And I just can't sit over a shoulder and watch him online his whole time. So there's a huge element of what's going on, but it's all digital and it's all virtual, and it's something that I'm just not a native to and can't really understand the way he can. So how do we come to terms with that? And wrapping up, just another plug for this exhibit. One of the things we're most excited about is we're going to create an 80s rec room as an immersive experience. So we've got our ugly couch all picked out. It's actually in this very building. We're going to have televisions. They will be hooked to VCRs. They will be hooked to an Atari and a Nintendo. We'll have a stereo where one can listen to a cassette tape. Try out an Apple IIc computer, read some vintage books, and really just kind of experience what it was like. And for those of us who are familiar with all of this, it might be kind of nostalgic. I'm looking forward to seeing, the way kids respond to this, like the way it was back then. So that's about the end of the talk. Hope to see you at the exhibition. And now I'll open it up if anyone has any questions, or if anyone, is there something that we should be sure to think about, or anyone just want to share memories or talk. Now's the time.
Are you going to have a section on the TV shows of the time at all?
Not so much the TV shows. We are going to have the movies But yes, there was only so much space. We do have like the TV, the cable box, but not like a deep dive into the TV shows.
On that line, is there any kind of copyright issue with playing portions of movies in public area?
So we did check with our lawyer, and in the gallery, it's considered fair use. So we're not going to put it out on social media or advertising or like use images, but if it's used, like snippets of it are used in the gallery setting, then it's considered an educational use.
And all those people who contributed comments, particularly thinking about the one who seems to have a daddy issue, are they okay with that being posted publicly?
So yeah, the part of the survey at the bottom was, like, I agree to let the museum use this, and, so they signed off when they submitted the survey.
Is there anything we're really hoping to get that didn't show up, like for donations or loans or anything like that? Like the 180s thing that you were really hoping for?
Nothing. Well, like, I don't know, just kind of like a pair of parachute pants would have been nice, or like a, authentic pair of leg warmers. But mainly we got some really cool things, and some of them like just surprisingly cool. Like one thing was a set of lyrics that was sent out by the Parents Music Advisory Council, or whatever Tipper Gore's commission was, to say, like, these lyrics are so offensive, we must censor them. And that commission would actually send out dot matrix printed lyrics to parents so they could, get all riled up. And someone saved that. The things that people save, the ephemera that survives, is like kind of cool. Or one man saved he was like fingerprinted in school, and there was, I didn't go into it here, but there was a rash of kind of high profile child kidnappings in the 80s. And so the idea of stranger danger or someone's face on a milk carton comes about in that era. And I would argue, has lasting effects today, and it's why we don't let our kids out the way that we were kind of turned out to play as young people.
Are we going to play either the mixtapes or have music playing? Or
Yes, we're getting a touchstones jukebox. So the jukebox itself is not of the period, but it'll be set to unlimited play, so anyone can go and dial up the nostalgic song of their choice.
So did Gen X parents become helicopter
I would say yes. And we did have a question of like, how does being Gen X affect your parenting? And so there's definitely a sense of like, I would never let my parents or my child roam around to the degree that I did. There's also like this, and I'm going to speak from personal experience here. It's an intellectual war that I fight, because I know that I had the same freedom, and I know that statistically children are actually safer today than they were tomorrow. So like my intellectual side says, yes, like give the child freedom, he'll be fine. But that fear that like kidnapping, stranger danger, someone in a white van pulling up and grabbing your kid is so deep and dark, and it kind of wins out, it's like, but I just don't want to take the chance. Like I would rather helicopter and be a little more like protective and keep him safe than like run the risk of something terrible happening.
And it
people
was
keep
always
an
a
eye
white
on
collar.
other people's kids. Like, people don't, when they see a kid out, they are worried about it, whereas like, people grew up in the streets and it wasn't an issue at all. But nowadays, like, people wouldn't, there's something wrong when a kid is walking to school alone or something like that, or running around in the afternoon, and sometimes they talk to parents, they call police.
Right.
Kid, it's the response of the community to kids being loose is totally different. In a positive way, sort of.
Right, it is, yeah. A positive way in the sense that like someone's looking and has an eye out, maybe in a negative sense of, there's been those stories of like the parents are like, yeah, we sent our kids to the park and they've got the police on them now, and they're being investigated. And
It's the park.
okay. Well, if there's no more questions, this is kind of the end of the talk. So yeah, thank you for coming out, and I hope you will come out to enjoy the exhibition.